All right, friends, welcome back. Now we're ready to talk about what is called as random walks and unit groups, fancy labels, fancy terms. Now, if a data set, a time series, is a random walk, meaning it has no discernible pattern, it's random, then trying to use a autoregressive model to try to demystify that pattern is an exercise in futility. So you can't model a random walk because by definition, the random walk pattern is random. All right. So the LOSs that we're going to cover is characteristics of random walk, implication of unit group, which is related to random walk, and then the unit group test. All right. So let's talk about the random walk, how we are going to define it. So defining characteristic of a random walk in an AR1 model is that the beta 1 is equal to 1. Remember earlier we said when beta 1 is equal to 1 that MRL is undefined. So you don't have a mean reverting level because the denominator of that MRL equation is 0. And that is a random walk. There are two kinds of random walk, with a drift or without it. With a drift, means that beta naught is not equal to 0. So we'll wait on that for a second, but without a drift, with beta naught, the intercept term is equal to 0. If you assume that beta naught, the intercept is equal to 0, then what ends up happening is xt in our AR model is simply equal to beta 1 times xt minus 1, 1 lat, AR1. Now that beta 1 is equal to 1, right? So we plug in the value of beta 1 in the equation, what do you get? Xt is equal to xt minus 1 plus the residual, the error. What that tells you is the best forecast of the next period is simply last period's value, the classic definition of random walk. In other words, more technically, more scientifically speaking, any change in xt is all attributed to the noise factor. To the error term. So we are saying that I really don't know what is causing the xt to behave. There is no pattern. There is only noise in the data. When you make that statement, then there is no point in modeling. Any model that you try to develop, if it is a random walk, will be non guess is the patch value of itself. Now, with the random walk with the drift where beta naught is not equal to the zero, then your xt is going to systematically change by the intercept term, but that is all that the model is saying. And then again, every other change is simply attributed to noise. So both of these are considered to be non-stationary. So random walks are non-stationary. There is no utility in trying to model it. And this beta equal to 1 is labeled as unit root. So unit means a value of 1. Unit root for the time series means beta 1 is equal to 1. And again, unit root is another label that you use commonly in place of random walk. So they are used interchangeably. So if you want to use an AR model, the absolute value of beta 1, so beta 1 in absolute sense, should be less than 1. So ignore the sign of beta 1, the slope coefficient, just make sure that it is less than 1. Now, what this statement is talking about is the true value of beta, true value of the slope coefficient for AR1 model. Not what you see from your sample. So if you're in your sample, you see 0.7456 as your beta 1. Well, you can't just say, hey, that is less than 1. I'm all good. It is not a unit root. I don't have any problem with covariance stationarity. No, I am talking about beta 1 is the true population parameter value. only see what is estimated sample value of that slope coefficient. So we have a formal test to check if there is a unit root present. You can't just take the estimated value as a proxy for the true value. Now, again, if beta 1 is equal to 1, then you have what is called as a unit root. If the absolute value of beta 1 is greater than 1, the other condition, so it has to be less than 1. If it is equal or greater, it is a problem. If it is equal, we call it unit root. If it is greater, then we call it an explosive root. Either way, you have a problem. Either way, the time series is not stationary and you can't use AR models. So unit root, we already said, if your beta 1 is equal to 1, your MRL is undefined. Now the key question is, how do you test for unit root? Now, normally in our standard hypothesis testing, you want to do null hypothesis of beta 1 equal to 1 versus alternate hypothesis beta 1 is not equal to 1. But we can't do that in this case with the standard t-test. Instead, we use what is called as a Dickey-Fuller modified t-test. And what Dickey-Fuller did was simply magnificent, simply beautiful, where we are simply revising our time series by taking first differences. So you have your time series data. Let's say in Excel you have 50 data points in column 1. You copy paste that column in the next column over. We call it xt minus 1. So corresponding to observation 2, you will have a copied value of observation 1. And then the next column is xt minus 1. Another way to talk about that is delta, or change in xt. And we can only do it for overlapping observations in the columns A and B, the first two columns. So that is called as first differencing the data. So we'll talk about that label in a second, but that is what the label is. We just did what is called as the first differencing, or calculating the change in the original time series. So before we do it with actual observation, let's understand what we are doing. So we are subtracting xt minus 1 on both sides of our AR model. So remember, our AR model was xt is equal to beta naught plus beta 1 xt minus 1 plus residual. So I'm subtracting xt minus 1 on both sides. And I'm taking xt minus 1 as common. So I get beta naught plus beta 1 times xt minus 1 minus it. I'm taking xt minus 1 as common. So I get beta naught plus beta 1 times xt minus 1 minus xt minus 1. So beta 1 minus 1 becomes the multiplier for the common factor xt minus 1. Now, xt minus 1 is equal to beta naught plus g1 times xt minus 1 plus the residual. So left hand side of the equation is change in xt, the right hand side is beta naught plus g1 times lag value of xt. And if there is unit root, then g1 will be equal to 0. If g1 is 0, what? Beta 1 will be equal to 1. So that is coming back to our original need to evaluate if the slope coefficient was 0. Sorry, slope coefficient was 1. Now, in the Dickey-Fuller test, if G, the hypothesis is not mutually exclusive like a traditional hypothesis testing. See, null hypothesis G is equal to 0 versus alternate hypothesis G is less than 0. And that is why we call it the modified Dickey-Fuller test. The modified t-test. And so we calculate the Dickey-Fuller test statistic for G1. You're not doing it as far as exam is concerned, but if you are checking of critical value vis-a-vis the calculated value and so forth, but the interpretation is very, very, very important, at least as far as the exam is concerned. So that is your Dickey-Fuller test to evaluate the presence of unit root. In this process, in this discussion, I went over what is called as first differencing, meaning calculating change in xt or changing the underlying time series from one period to the next. And that approach, the first differencing, also can remove non-stationarity in a time series. So if your time series is trending up or down, meaning it has no it's not at a constant mean. Remember earlier that if the series is not stationary, we can't use AR models. Well, first differencing will allow us to remove that non-stationarity, make it stationary, and now we can use AR models. So simply doing first differencing, instead of xt, we are now modeling change in xt. We're going to call it YT. So if you have a trending model, and here it is trending upwards model, instead of xt, we are now modeling change in xt, and we're going to call it YT. So if you have a trending model, and here it is trending upwards model, well, that's not a constant mean, it's not stationary, but by simply calculating the change in xt and modeling the change, then now you have a stationary time series, you can use AR models. So it is one approach if the stationarity is not there in the original time series, we can use first differencing to introduce stationarity before we apply or before we use AR models. All right, we'll next talk about seasonality, but that is in the next module. Okay, friends, welcome back, and now we are ready to talk about the last captures that pattern to be able to forecast the future. If the underlying data set has seasonality, meaning same thing occurring every year, for example, retail sales would have December seasonality. If you see a seasonality in data, then your model should capture that seasonality. And how do you do that? So let's get started. Only one LOS associated with this material. So seasonality means time series shows consistent seasonal pattern. If that is the case, to capture the seasonality in the data, what you do is to introduce a lag to capture that seasonality. So if it is quarterly data, we use fourth lag. That would represent the same period of the prior year. So if you're looking at the third quarter of this year, then you want to compare it to third quarter of last year. Well, how many lags between third quarter of this year to third quarter of last year?
12.
4 lags, and so forth. If it is monthly data, use 12th lag, and so forth. So that is your seasonality. Now, now, labeling, if you have, for example, a model that is described like this. Now, by design, I'm looking at this general specification of an AR model, and I'm saying, oh, 12 lag, that must be the seasonal component in the model. That must be seasonal lag, and so it appears that the data is monthly. That should be given to me directly, but just by looking at it, I can conclude that most likely data is monthly. We call this model as an AR1 model with a seasonal lag. So you may be tempted to simply call it AR2 model because there are 2 lags in the model, first lag and 12th lag. But for whatever reason, statisticians call it AR1 with a seasonal lag. So just a label thing, nothing fancy about it. Doesn't change the substance of what we are learning. So here we have an example from the curriculum where we are trying to model quarterly sales for Starbucks, and they are basically first taking the natural log of the data. So there must be some non-linearity in the raw data. We are converting it into linear, and basically one lag. It's an AR1 model. Now, when you look at the output, it is really modeling the change in X variable. So after taking the log, there is first differencing going on, which is not clearly defined or clearly identified in that example. Keep in mind that this is straight from the curriculum, but I can see it based on what they have given to us as part of the regression output. And R square is about 20, R square is 20%. So not a great model, not a whole lot of explanation given by this AR model. Nonetheless, it's still statistically significant. You get the coefficient, the change to be very statistically significant. So it helps me develop a little better forecast of So now, after fitting that AR1 model, I remember always check for autocorrelation in my time series in my model. So I look at autocorrelation in the residuals. And what I see is, again, I'm using 2.0 as a approximate cutoff point. The sample size is 72, so I should be okay with that cutoff point. And I see that the fourth lag autocorrelation is statistically significant. Why? Because the t-stat of 6.47 is, higher than 2.0. Other ones are negative, so they are not less than -2. But the fourth one is appearing to be problematic. So I see a seasonality evident in the autocorrelation of residuals. In other words, the residuals are exhibiting a pattern which my model should be capturing. So my model is incomplete. What I do is I include the fourth lag in my model. I include the seasonal lag and see what will be the case. Again, I'm really using the first difference to data. Remember, first difference is, xt minus 1, and that we call as delta xt, or we can also call it yt, doesn't matter. And then, so here, the first one is yt minus 1 and yt minus 4 as my two explanatory variables in my autoregressive model. So what I see is R square has improved a lot, and both these coefficients are statistically significant. And I just want to be clear, what they have done is this xt is first transformed by taking natural log. So when I get the forecast, I need to be careful how I use the forecast in converting it into dollar change in this case, revenues. So after I do that, I again check to see if there is any statistically significant autocorrelation in the residuals. Now I don't see it. And so that tells me that the second model, including the seasonal lag, is a much better model, much better fit for that data set. So now we can use, and this is a different model, not the Starbucks model. So you are given occupancy level for 2024. Here are the four data set. The data set is quarterly. So xt is first, we take the natural log. So model is log of xt is equal to, The log of xt minus 1, which is 485,000, first lag. I'm calculating for first quarter of 2025, the quarter prior to it with the last quarter of 2024. The seasonal lag, the corresponding to the first quarter of 2025, would be the first quarter of 2024, which is 365,000. So beta 2 multiplied by log of 365,000. Just plugging the values in, and we get 12.97. Again, that is the natural log, not the raw data. I need to convert it. So e raised to 12.19779, that gives you 432,743. That is my forecasted occupancy for this data set, for this example. All right, so that is it for the time series reading. As usual, spend equal amount of time in doing practice questions so as to identify the level of understanding you got. So it is an assessment process that is built in. Wonderful, keep up the good work. All right, arch and time series. So now just a little extraneous, very minor component here to talk about models, modeling conditional hyperoscedasticity in an AR model. So you have this fancy label arch, it just stands for conditional hyperoscedasticity in AR model. Now, what is conditional hyperoscedasticity? We remember from multiple regression, conditional hyperoscedasticity means that the residual term does not have a constant variance. Not only that, that non-constant variance is linked or related to the x variables, in this case lag values that you've included in your AR model. So the result of existence of arch in your AR model, the result of existence of conditional hyperoscedasticity in your your AR model makes your standard errors unreliable, as usual. Remember, we already know this from multiple regression. Your hypothesis testing is invalid, so your model evaluation would be problematic. However, in presence of conditional heteroscedasticity allows me to be able to forecast the variance in the future period. Remember, the variance is systematically linked to what? To the past values of the underlying variable. Here, we are basically using lagged variance, not the value of x variable. So we are not using the raw time series data, but simply the lagged variance of the residual. The variance is modeled as the square value of the residual. Remember, in variance is equal to et minus 1 divided by n minus 1. Well, because the expected value of residual is 0, we can just take, I'm sorry, this one is squared. That is why we are just taking the square of the residual as a proxy for variance. Now, if I knew the proxy for variance, sorry, this one is squared. That is why we are just taking the square of the residual, because the expected value of residual is 0, we can just take, I'm sorry, this one is squared. That is why we are just taking the square of the residual as a proxy for variance. Now, if I do this, if I apply this this equation and estimate the regression parameter A1 using my standard regression parameter estimation techniques, and that A1 is significant, that means what? The variance in next period is related to the variance in the prior period. That is this. everything was we applied in our AR model. But we can then use that values of A0, the intercept, and A1 in forecasting volatility. So just a qualitative concept to keep in mind. Presence of arch allows me to forecast future volatility of the residual term. So you're asked, given a regression output, here we are looking at arch 1, so one lag only for the residual variance. And instead of betas, we are calculating AI, which is basically the arch series. And I'm really focusing on that one variable, in this case, lag 1. And the p-value given to us is less than 0.001. So if my level of significance is 1%, still this value of A1 is significant. So that tells me that yes, there is arch 1. So the low p-value is indication of an arch series, and I need to recognize that I can't rely on the standard error as calculated by my model. So I can count.
Hey guys, who's studying with me? Oh hey, I hate studying. Hulk might shoot green. Okay, so we are reporting that one. Harassment or bullying. harassing me? Report. Okay, we are also, hiding the user from this channel. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. What else are you guys studying? Oh, what are you guys studying? DH1 in DSA. When you've got a minute to break, just type in the chat what you're studying so we know.
Calculate the expected value, and you get 8.31. Again, we are just plugging in. Remember, 8.1745 is the constant plus 0.2873 multiplied by the prior variance value, which is given as 0.4728. You get 8.31 as the forecasted variance using ARCH. Now, a related concept is if you have multiple time series, and that is typical in a multiple regression model. So you have company profit is the dependent variable, and then you have advertising expenditure, whatever, as your different X variables. So each of these variables are collected over time, maybe every quarter of the as reported by the company. When you have multiple time series in a model, in a regression model, you need to evaluate whether any of these time series has unit root. In other words, is it a random walk? So the way you evaluate the existence of unit root in a multiple time series problem is to determine whether the y variable, the dependent variable, has a unit root, x variable has a unit root, whether they both have a unit root, and then determine whether you can use the model or not. So it is kind of like marriage. A crazy person can marry a normal person, or can marry a crazy person. Now, a marriage is likely to succeed if either both parties are normal or both parties are crazy. So that is the idea. So both the time series are integrated, then you can use the model, otherwise not. All right, so that's it for this residual parts of auto time series meeting. Keep up the good work and do lots of practice question again. Pretty bent over.
CFA Level II candidates, my name is Jim Marr. In this brief video, we're just going to give you a quick review of ethical and professional standards, and we have two pieces I'm sure you're quite familiar with from Level 1, our Code of Ethics, and number 2, our Standards of Professional Conduct. Now, I really encourage candidates to spend some time in ethics leading up to their exam day. You can get some significant study alpha in this topic. For every hour you put in to ethics, it can really pay off for you on exam day. Now we know on exam day you're going to see 22 case studies. You're going to get 88 questions. 10 to 15% of these questions are going to derive from ethics, right? Which means you're going to see about 2 to 3 case studies just on ethics, or 8 to 12 questions out of your 88. Now, what I want to make you aware of is if you're right below that minimum passing score, you scored really well on ethics, you get what's called the ethics adjustment, and you will pass your test. I'm sure that's very important to you leading up to exam day. So spend some time here on ethics. Now, you probably recall too from Level 1, you really need to focus on the specifics in the standards, being able to pick out the nuances, not just the generalities, if you will. All right, let's take a look at the CFA Institute Professional Conduct Program. And all CFA Institute members and candidates for the CFA designation are required to comply with the code and standards. CFA Institute Board of Governors maintains oversight and responsibility for the Professional Conduct Group, which in conjunction with the Disciplinary Review Committee is responsible for enforcement of the code and standards. So nothing earth-shattering there, probably nothing you haven't seen before. CFA Institute, through the professional conduct staff, will conduct inquiries related to what? Professional conduct. Okay? Now, an inquiry can be prompted by the following. I hope you never have to go through any of these. Now, first up would be what we call self-disclosure by your member or your candidate here. And you must self-disclose on an annual professional conduct statement, or say PCS. All matters that question their professional conduct. Okay, that's key here. Such as involvement in civil litigation or a criminal investigation or being the subject of a written complaint, which leads us right here into bullet point number 2. Written complaints about a member or a candidate's professional conduct. There's some evidence of misconduct by a member or candidate. And I always see the fourth one, and it sort of makes me chuckle a little bit. If you get in trouble at the testing center, that's really on you at that point. Don't do anything dumb on exam day. Don't try to sneak any notes into the testing center, okay, into the room. You really don't want to do that. So just listen to what the proctor tells you to do. Don't raise any suspicions. You know, all you can really bring in the room is going to be your calculator and a bottle of water. They're going to give you what you need. You know, at this point, you've already taken Level 1. You're going to get some scratch paper, a couple pencils, and that's it. You'll be good to go. So don't do anything that would cause any sort of suspicion by an exam proctor. And also analysis of exam scores and materials, monitoring of websites and social media as well. Okay. Now the CFA Institute Professional Conduct staff may decide that the following things can happen to you. Now I once again hope these never come across your path. They could believe that there's no disciplinary sanctions are appropriate for your behavior. They can issue a cautionary letter, or they can discipline you. I really hope that once again you never have that happen. Sanctions may include condemnation by the member's peers or suspension of the candidate's participation in the CFA program. Now, maybe you see a test question there, so I'll put a TQ test question and a question mark next to that, because you might see something here, what they could do based on what you've seen in your case facts. One of these 3 types of decisions could be made. So maybe you see something along those lines. But once again, there's other more important things that they can test. All right, first up, we're going to look again at the Code of Ethics. You've seen this before in Level 1. Like I said, nothing really earth-shattering here, nothing too difficult. You know that the code has 6 parts, right? You don't need to identify that there are 6 parts. But what you want to do is you want to know that there are 6. First up, like it says, we want to act with integrity, competence, diligence, respect, and in an ethical manner with the public, clients, prospects, employers, employees, colleagues. In other words, just behave yourself. Act in an ethical manner, and you'll be good to go. Okay? Now, the issue arises here when we're defining what is acting in an ethical manner. You probably are familiar with that, looking at that through the various practice questions that you've done in also in your studies in level 2. Now, as you see, as we go through the code and into the standards, we'll get a much finer definition of these various points here. Now, integrity is paramount, right? That's our number 2 here, point 2. And the big one is client's interests above personal interests. And when I see that, always keep this in mind. You're going to see it coming up again in a little bit. Clients come first. They're in front of everybody in the pecking order, okay? So I want you to be aware of that. Like I said, you should know that by now, that clients come first, okay? Very, very important. All right, let's look at the third point here. And this is when you're acting in your role as an investment advisor, analyst, or portfolio manager. You have an ethical responsibility to exercise reasonable care and independent professional judgment. Now, when you're engaged in professional activities, for example, making recommendations, you're expected to have reasonable care once again. What does that mean? Well, you're going to invest the money as it was your own. And you will not have your judgment tainted by some sort of outside conflict of interest, okay? And that's really what gets the star here. You need to use reasonable care and also be independent, okay? You also want to practice and encourage others to act in a professional manner. Be a credit to your profession. Everybody wins, and like I say here, everybody wins, right? So let's put that here. Everybody wins when we act in an ethical manner, right? Us and the investing public. You know, hopefully we'll make some money, and they'll make some money. So everybody wins. Okay. Now let's look at our next point here. We want to promote integrity of capital markets for the ultimate benefit of society. I also alluded to that on our last screen here. We don't want the investing public to lose faith in the capital markets, as they're an essential part of the wealth creation process in our society, right? People lose faith in the capital markets, they're not going to invest in the capital markets. And that would not be a good thing, obviously. And that can lead to some seriously bad outcomes, especially in the economy. So what do we want to do? We want to uphold capital market rules and regulations. And lastly, maintain and improve professional competence and strive to do the same for other investment professionals. In other words, what? Yes, you got that right. Be competent. We want to maintain and improve our professional competence throughout our career. Personally, I'm a lifelong learner. I got my CFA in my middle 50s and continuing to read on a daily basis and possibly pursue another designation. That's a talk for another day. And we also want to encourage other people to come along. I feel, now I'm a little older, hopefully a little wiser, a little experienced. I can help other individuals make these choices to improve themselves and maybe become a CFA as well. So we want to be competent and help our friends and colleagues in the industry. Like I said, we want to be competent as well. Well, that's going to wrap up this section. Nothing really that difficult. It's really basic stuff. And you really got to ask yourself, what kind of questions would they ask about the code of ethics? Maybe you'd see a couple of one or two here. And really, it boils down to, should you be competent or not when we're looking at the code of ethics and acting in an ethical manner. You think of the code basically as an umbrella covering the standards of professional conduct, which we're going to jump right into now. And lucky for you, I put already a few notes here on our screens. I've done that on all of them here. It's pretty much a, once again, high-level overview. I'm more concerned that you get into practicing and reading case studies and knowing how to analyze cases. And in another video that we're going to have in here for level 2, I go over a couple cases with you. So you want to take a look at the Standards of Practice Handbook. That may be leading up to the last month of your exams. Scoot through that. Look at the examples. Very important that you look for the nuances, the specifics. Remember I mentioned that, not the generalities. So first up in the Standards of Professional Conduct, you don't have to know these by number and letter. Just pretty much know them. Be able to pick out violations. It's so important, especially at level 2. Being able to read the case facts and ask yourself, is a violation occurring here or is it not? And it can be tricky to determine that, but if you spend some time here and look for those specifics, you'll be well on your way to passing. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to have our knowledge of the law, right? And we got to follow the most strict. We got to know what the ethical laws and regulations are where you're doing business. You've seen that probably frequently in level 1. Now, obviously, that's the big one, independence and objectivity. It's maintaining your professional independence independence and objectivity is going to be a key part of you being able to honor your fiduciary responsibility, right? Misrepresentation, this one's all about being honest. That can really be, being honest and ethical. Misconduct, now this one is don't do anything that you're not supposed to do. It's something that even your mother would be upset that you did. It's all about acting in a professional manner and conducting yourself professionally, if you will, right? And then, of course, we got to act with confidence. We got to know what we're doing. And that goes along with what we're studying here to pass our CFA exam, and also possibly doing some continuing education. Always growing, always being, and I really like to say this, a lifelong learner, maintaining our competence in a specific area. And that's really important when you're looking at exam questions, where you might not be that familiar with derivatives, or the case facts rather is saying that the advisor is not that familiar with derivatives, and you have a client come in and they want to invest in derivatives. What do you do? Do you take the order? Do you find another professional to help you out? Those kind of things. Do you take a course for continuing ed? So that's an excellent kind of test question when we're talking about competence. Be familiar with that for your exam. All right, number 2, integrity of capital markets is, I'm going to circle that one. That one gets the star. That one gets the test question. Material non-public information is more than likely going to be something on your test. What are you going to do with material non-public information? You know the answer, absolutely nothing. You need to be able to just pretty much hide it and tuck it away. You need to know the two terms, right, for your exam, material and non-public. So it's got to be material, it's got to mean something. And non-public, something that's not out in the public sphere or public market. It's not out there, okay? So just be familiar with those two by now. I would say you are, but you got to be really careful with the specifics, knowing how to pick out something that might be material and non-public. It might be immaterial, right? It wouldn't drive the stock price, but no one knows about it. It's non-public. Well, it's immaterial non-public. So you really need to focus on the definitions of each of those words. Know the terms, you'll be good to go. And you cannot manipulate the market. You can't distort prices. You can't artificially inflate trading volume. I think that also sets itself up for a great test question. If you're manipulating the market, you are destroying the public faith in the market, and that can result in negative societal impacts. So basically, don't do it. You'll be okay. Duties to clients. Now, this one could be considered the centerpiece of the 7 standards. I really like this one. You know what the rule is. Clients first. If you follow this for your exam, I think you can get a test question correct, just remembering that. And you got to be careful with that. You got to be really clear that you might say, well, what if they didn't come first? Or maybe I could put my employer ahead of the client in this respect. No, you never can. Clients are always first. Okay, that gets the big one. So maybe you spend a little more time focusing on duties to clients, because violations of the standard wind up in the news and also possibly in court, and you do not want to be part of that. So where does your loyalty lie? That's a great test question. You should know that. Switch colors for you because I'm going to put another star. Yes, it is clients first. If you're not meeting your ethical responsibility to your client, this is probably the worst of all the ethical violations you commit. Okay, so this one really gets the big star. Fair dealing, you have to simply deal with all clients fairly, not just the big ones, not just your favorite ones. Everybody gets to play. Okay, so you got to be dealing fairly with all clients. You can't just segregate large, high fee-based clients or ones you like a little more over other ones. So everybody is treated the same. Fair dealing. I think that's a great test question. Now, here's one that shows up over and over again. This one gets, as you see, the bigger star on your screen. Suitability basically says that any professional activity, we have to consider a specific recommendation in a portfolio context. Okay? And it's got to meet all of the client's wishes. You just can't meet 3 out of 5. You might see something where the client says, I want risk to look like this, return to look like this. I don't want to invest in oil. Maybe that'd be a good one. Some sort of ESG factor thrown in there. I need the money in 5 years, and so on. Well, you got to pick a portfolio or an investment in the portfolio clients. And then another big one here, preservation of confidentiality. Simply, the rule is don't share your client information. If you have privileged information, keep it to yourself. Now, you need to know when you can share client information, for example, when you're working with other professionals who are working on the same client, working with the same person. So be really careful there, as far as assistance, or better yet, get your client's permission to do so. Get it in writing, and you'll be good to go. All right? Now we're looking at duties to our employer. Obviously, we do have a duty to our employer. We have to be loyal to our employers. That's right. The big one here is additional compensation arrangements. And when we're looking at that, I put conflict with a question mark because that's really the big one here. If I'm receiving money from doing an outside job, does it conflict with the job I'm doing for my employer? Okay? That's the big question. That's also an excellent test question for your exam. And it goes all back to the favorite D word, disclosure. You can never get wrong with disclosure. So with additional compensation arrangements, you need to understand when the circumstances under which this is permitted, and you need to be familiar, once again, with the disclosure requirements. Very important. And also responsibilities of supervisors. This requires a high standard for what would constitute safe harbor. Supervisors need to be active to comply with the standards. So a supervisor can't just sit around and wait for things to happen. They need to take an active role at the firm. Okay? Moving on to investment analysis, recommendations, and actions. Letter A, I was going to say number A. Letter A is the big one. Really important part of the code and standards here. When making recommendations, we need diligence and reasonable basis. I think this ties into suitability quite a bit as well, and you probably can make that connection also. So I really think that's really one you want to focus on here. B is all about how we communicate our investment analysis and our recommendations to our client. I put our favorite word up here, our D word again. It's all about doing adequate disclosure so your clients can make informed decisions, educated decisions. Of course, with your guidance and record retention, simply put, you need to retain your sources when you're performing analysis. Basically, you need to be able to defend what you say, defend your recommendations, okay? So it's important that you keep records. I like that one. Test question 2. Now new for 2025, we must avoid or disclose conflicts of interest. I'm going to circle avoid. That might be a little bit hard in some circumstances, right? But you must make full and fair disclosure of all matters that can reasonably be expected to impair your independence and objectivity, okay? I did read that directly from my notes, and I need you to know that. That disclosure needs to be full and fair, and also has to be in plain language. It can't be in some sort of jargon or lingo. I really like that as a test question, okay? So spend a little time in the standards reading about avoiding conflicts of interest. Oh yeah, priority of transactions. You know this, clients first, right? This addresses the issue of when we trade for our account versus our firm versus our client. We know the rules, clients first. Be really careful. Tuck this away in your notes. Look for questions that address what's called beneficial owners. Spend a little bit of time on that. And then referral fees also. This is when you're referring a client to another professional. Are you getting a fee, some sort of compensation for that? And what are the specific disclosure requirements if that is the case? Okay, so I think that also lends itself to a decent test question for you too. Now, we may agree that all investment let's see if I can say that right? We may agree that all investment professionals should aspire to adhere to the first 6 standards, and this last one right here applies to you as a candidate in the CFA Institute program. The way we reference the CFA institution or institute and our participation in the program, and how we refer to the designation once you are a charter holder. So it's all about the conduct as participants in the program, and also reference to the CFA Institute, the CFA designation, and the program. So you want to spend some time there. You're always allowed, say, to give your opinion, but I would say, be pretty careful with that. You don't want to do anything disparaging to a CFA institute. You can say the test is hard. That's fair. You can say that, but you just can't give out specifics on, what's the exam. So what do you need to do to successfully pass your test at level 2? You've got to be able to analyze and case study. You You need to look for those nuances. You need to look at the specifics. If something requires you to have three things, if you will, to create a violation, and you've only seen the case facts you've committed two, chances are you don't have a violation. So you got to really look for little key words and clues and things like that to get these questions right. They do get tricky at level 2, but luckily for you, all the time you put in ethics in level 2, it's going to carry over for you when you get into level 3. So you need to have working knowledge of these standards. How do you get that working knowledge? Yeah, you know what I'm going to tell you if you've been with me on other videos. It's all about practicing. That is the key here, being able to understand what CFA Institute is asking you, right? And remember, you don't need to memorize the numbering system, but be able to pick out violations. Very, very, very key on your test. Whether or not something is a violation. How do you get good at doing that? Practice and reviewing the examples, also the standards and practice handbook leading up to your exam. All right, that's all I have for you in this video. In the next one, we're going to talk about some case studies, so take a look at that in your activity feed. Hi, and welcome back to Ethical and Professional Standards. Now, this is the big stuff. This is the guide.
Is anyone studying with me or am I all alone? I have probably 20 to 30 more minutes and then I'm out. Yeah, in about 3 hours. I think it's good progress. But my dashboard isn't saying that, so that's a bit weird. But let's see.
Hi, and welcome back to Ethical and Professional Standards. Now, this is the big stuff. This is the guidance for the standards. There's lots of detail you're going to need to know to be successful on exam day. So you're going to have to study this material with a powerful magnifying glass to be successful. Trust me, the time and effort you put into studying ethics will pay huge dividends on exam day. Underline, take notes. Most importantly, practice, practice, practice. Lots of questions. All right, so in our summary of the standards of practice, we're going to focus on describing 3 things that I went ahead and put on the screen in front of you. Number 1, actions that clearly violate subsection. Number 2, behaviors that each subsection is intended to encourage or discourage. And number 3, recommended best practices for members and their firms. So just keep that in mind as we go through each standard. Now, here we go with standard number 1, professionalism. Now remember, I mentioned this previously, you do not need to know the numbering system, so don't be concerned with, hey, this is 1A. You need to know there's a standard called knowledge of the law. On an exam, you're going to simply need to know what standard has been violated. Hence, knowledge of the law. I'm not going to say standard 1A as your answer choice. So, knowledge of the law. We need to understand and comply with all laws, rules, and regulations, including the code and standards of any government, regulatory agency, or association governing professional activities. Now, I'm going to go through a really brief example. If you want to jot this down, this is fine. I would say it's highly testable. So, we're going to look at 3 different countries. And in our first country, X here, there's no security laws or regulations. Country Y, there are less strict securities laws and regulations than the code and standards. And in country Z, they have more strict security laws and regulations than the code and standards. And once again, you're going to see this probably in practice questions and mock exams and so on. Get really good at this. So here's the deal. You live in country X and you're doing business in country Y. So which law would apply here? It's a fabulous test question. When you live in X, there's no securities laws or regulation, but you're working in Y, and they have less strict rules than the code and standards. So if you said, I need to adhere to the code and standards here, you were correct. Now, Z has more strict laws and regs than the code and standards. So if you are an X and you're doing business in Z, what's the rule here? You would follow country Z because they are more strict than the code and standards. Pretty simple stuff. Easy, easy point on your exam. So once again, you want to comply with the more strict law, rule, or regulations. Not really too difficult. You might see an example, something like along the lines of insider trading. That's a good one. So if you lived in country X where there's no laws or regulations, probably insider trading would be okay. The problem is you can't do it, right? Because it's unethical according to the code and standards. So you must abide by the stricter. So if you're in X and you're doing business in X, in my example, yeah, you certainly might be able to get away with insider trading because there's no rule against it or law against it, but you would be violating the code and standards. So abide by the stricter. Very important. And then do not knowingly assist in a violation. Otherwise, you need to disassociate from that activity. And knowingly is the key. assist anyone in a violation. But if you notice a violation here, you need to dissociate from that activity. I like to say disassociate, not a word, dissociate. So pardon me there. All right, moving on to the guidance here. Now, what about the guidance for this standard? This is something you must do. When you see guidance, these are the rules. So what happens if you notice a violation? Well, we already covered the most strict, the law, the rule, the regulation. Well, if you notice a violation, it's really covered on the second, third, and fourth bullet point here. You first need to notify a supervisor or your compliance department. So something's amiss, you think something's wrong, well, you got to go and do that. And then dissociate if necessary. I sort of covered that. Now, you're not required, say, to do number 3. Even though it's guidance, you may, that's the key word there, confront the wrongdoer directly, but you might not want to say, hey, Joe, I think you've been doing something over here like money laundering, so you really need to stop it. No, I probably would go to your supervisor or compliance department or something along those lines. And if you know he's doing it, you're involved with him at all, you might want to dissociate from it. Now, if you don't do anything, you witness something that's going on, but you choose, I don't really think this money laundering thing's a really big issue. Your inaction may be construed as participation and be a violation of the code and standards. So, probably want to say blow the whistle on whistleblowing, right? Now, there's no requirement to say be a whistleblower, if you will. So there's no requirement to report a violation to the government authorities except for money laundering. So maybe that was a great example. So the code says you don't have to report, but in the U.S. you must report. So the code says that you don't have to report violations to governmental authorities, but the law here in the United States says you do. So once again, if you witnessed Joe doing some money laundering, you would have to report his violations to the government in this certain case here. So the difficulty, really when we're looking at this, is knowing what is required guidance. I think it's important. I'm going to put that there, circle it for you, versus what is recommended procedures. Procedures will help you comply with the standard, but they're not required. So let me say that again. The difficulty here is knowing what is required guidance, versus what is recommended or best practices. The procedures are going to help you comply with the standard once again, but they're not required. So let's go ahead and take a look at some recommended procedures here. Well, we simply want to keep informed, regularly review written compliance procedures, record retention, maintain our files. Now, if you work for a large U.S. firm, chances are your firm has already adopted a code of ethics. But if you're in a small firm, maybe you need to encourage your firm to adopt the code and standards here, or adopt a code of ethics, if you will. The code of standards would be a good place to start. And of course, you want to seek compliance and legal advice as needed. And once again, encourage your firm to adopt a code of ethics if they don't already have one. All right, other recommended procedures. You need to know about changes in the laws and make sure others are up to date. So distribute information internally on applicable laws and regulations. If you see something, you need to tell someone, and how you do that at your firm is covered right here with having written procedures for reporting suspected violations. And you're recommended to report violations, right? But not required. So members are strongly encouraged to report violations by other members, but not required except if it's by law. And that was the United States, the money laundering example I gave you. All right, this is a big one. Put a star gives you a pen, unless maybe it's a special gold Mont Blanc pen, but if it's just a little plastic pen with the name of the company on it and handed to you, that's no big deal. We don't think that's going to compromise your integrity, just by receiving a pen. So from the CFA Institute, though, what they say is receiving a gift, benefit, or consideration from a client can be distinguished from gifts given by entities seeking influence a member or candidate to the detriment of other clients. So we have a really low threshold here. We're looking on at that there. So you really want to be aware of, will you get a gift from maybe like that wholesaler? Could that influence your behavior? And that pretty low standard here. If you're going to get an all expenses paid trip to Hawaii from your wholesaler, that might influence your behavior to give that wholesaler a little more business than say another one who only gave you a pen, right? Now getting a gift from a client, that might not influence you as significantly as getting a gift from an entity. So to be able to distinguish between the two here, and really what we're looking at is influencing your behavior. Now you can accept a gift from your client. You want to disclose that to your employer. Right there, I'm going to circle that. You need to know some specifics on that. You need to, whether it be written or oral, and you got to get permission if it's for future performance. So say you get a gift from a client, maybe it's a Skybox at a local sporting event. Well, you need to disclose that to your employer in a timely fashion. That's another one where I would encourage you to review specifics in the Standards of Practice Handbook and also practice questions to get really familiar with that third bullet point. The key here, when you see disclose to your employer, let's do this here. I'm going to write a word. It's always, there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You must always disclose that to your employer. Very important. All right, continuing on with your guidance. You do not accept gifts that impair your objectivity. You must make objective decisions for the best interest of your client. Members are responsible for hiring outside managers, should not accept travel, gifts, or entertainment that could impair their objectivity. The investment bankers cannot influence your buy-sell decisions here. You must be independent and objective. You can't bow to the pressure to create a favorable research report. That's a great test question as well. And if you're paid to write a report, a flat fee structure is preferred. And of course, there's our favorite word, you must disclose. These are things you must do. Okay? All right, more guidance here. You must avoid the influence of issuing firms. So members working for credit rating firms should avoid influence by the issuing firm. That they pressure you to give a favorable credit rating when you really think they should not be as highly rated. Now, there could be bias in the ratings and how that would affect your decisions. So users of credit ratings should be aware of this potential conflict. And what's the best practice here? Well, unfortunately, you got to pay for your own commercial travel to firms being analyzed or to firm events. So pay for your own commercial travel. That I'm going to put quotes around it. Test question there, because I think it's excellent. You do not want to be flying on the firm's private jet, enjoying champagne and eating caviar while your feet are up getting a massage on your trip. So be very careful there. And it's probably going to be pretty obvious if it's something that can influence your behavior. And that's really what we're looking for here when we're talking about guidance. All right, now, what is recommended? Like I said, there's a difference between guidance and recommendations. Key point here, once again, we need to protect the integrity of our opinions. So we need to avoid things that will bias our opinions. So this is the bottom line. We need to, once again, protect the integrity of our opinions. Reports should reflect an unbiased opinion. There's our star, if you will. Here, we might want to create a restricted list, no new opinions, no employee trading in that firm. We want to restrict special cost arrangements. We also want to limit gifts. Maybe we have a clear value limit set by our firm. That would be a fabulous test question as well. Maybe your firm only limits gifts up to $25 and your wholesaler wants to give you a $150 fishing reel because you're a fisherman. Hi, and welcome back to Ethical and Professional Standards. Let's go ahead and take a look at Standard 1C, misrepresentation. And the standard is pretty straightforward. Do not make misrepresentations relating to investment analysis, recommendations, actions, or other professional activities. In other words, candidates, don't lie. So I want you to think of misrepresentation as lying. Lo and behold, if you lie, you have violated the standards. Don't lie. Now let's take a look at the guidance. Well, the standard covers all communication. Very important point for your exam. That be oral, written, and electronic communication, such as email. Now, you do not misrepresent your qualifications, your services that you provide and your firm provides, your performance records. So you can't say, hey, Mr. Client, I've earned 15% a year for the last 10 years, when in actuality, you've only earned 10% over the last 10 years. That would be slightly exaggerating your performance record. You cannot do that. Or the characteristics of an investment, and when I see that, I really think of underestimating risk. So I want to tuck that away in my mind for the exam. And also, very important, you can't guarantee a certain return. You can't say, hey, Mr. Client, this investment's done pretty good over the last 5 years. It's earned a 5% rate of return. So I think over the next 5 years, I can guarantee superior performance as well, and you will get at least a 5% rate of return. Well, that would be a violation. So you can't guarantee a certain return. And also, no plagiarism. You are not permitted to use other people's work without proper attribution to the source. So keep that in mind. Everything here, I think, is fair game for your exam. Some sort of scenario, but it should be pretty evident what the answer would be. So let's move on to our recommended procedures. Well, the firms can assist employees by providing a written list of the firm's available services and a description of the firm's qualifications. And if you work for a big firm, chances are they've already done this for their employees. And of course, you want to maintain records of materials used to prepare research reports. Once again, you need to quote your source, except for recognized financial and statistical reporting services. So if you're using someone else's work, that's okay, right? But you need to review the quality of the work. So let's go ahead and put that here, quality of the work. And once again, you've got to quote the source. But as you can see, there's a couple of exceptions here. So if you were quoting, say for instance, the performance of the U.S. stock market, and you gathered your data from Ibbotson, you do not need to quote that source. You know, for the exam, this could be tricky, but it hopefully should be obvious. Like you can quote things from Ibbotson, say S&P, but if you're using some information from an outside source or another firm, you gotta ask yourself two questions, right? You ask yourself first, is the information any good? Then once again, quote the source. Very important for your exam. All right, let's look at some more recommended procedures. Well, we have models and analysis of others at the firm. May be used without attribution. So if you're on the same team at the firm, you do not need to cite the source. So say, for example, your colleague developed some sort of model or spreadsheet. You can use it. You can borrow the information and write your report without attribution. So I'm going to put a check mark by that. That'd be a great test question. And you should encourage firms to establish procedures for verifying marketing claims of third parties recommended to clients. So when providing information to clients from a third party, members and candidates share responsibility for the accuracy of the marketing and distribution materials that pertain to the third party's capabilities, services, and products. And when I say that, sort of think about doing a little bit of due diligence, right? All right, now let's move on to misconduct, standard 1D. And here's an easy test to determine if you're not behaving properly. Hence, misconduct is ask yourself the following: would your mother approve of this behavior? And if your mother would not approve, or you would be embarrassing your mother, then probably you do not want to do this. So do not engage in any professional conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or commit any act that reflects adversely on professional reputation, integrity, or competence. Don't do what you know you shouldn't do, and you'd be okay, all right? Now, there's a very good example of this. So you can see a good question of something that goes on about something somebody does, outside their professional activity, but it could affect their professional activity. So for example, you have a financial advisor who belongs to a country club, and the financial advisor goes to the country club at lunch and orders, a nice club sandwich, but orders just one too many cocktails. So now we have an advisor that's enjoyed a little bit too much to drink at lunch, gets a little bit drunk, goes back to the office, and then does some work. Well, now we have a violation, right? Because he's doing something that can reflect adversely on his professional reputation. So you got to be really careful there. See the nuance? The act of actually getting drunk at lunch is really not the big deal. But then he went back to work. That's the issue there. So you got to be really careful with some of these examples on your exam. Now, in terms of guidance, let's take a look at this. The standard covers conduct that may not be illegal. That was pretty good, right? The guy can go back to his office and get drunk. And let's assume he didn't drive back to his office for just a moment. He had a lift or something there. He came with a buddy. Can adversely affect a member's ability to perform the duties. Perfect example there. So if the conduct impairs your professional integrity, or once again, you're doing something that's going to embarrass your mother, then it is covered by the misconduct standard. Now, in terms of recommended procedures, we want to adopt a code of ethics to which every employee must adhere. We want to disseminate a list of potential violations and associated disciplinary sanctions. And we also want to conduct background checks. I think there's a great test question here on potential employees. We're looking for good character, eligibility to work in the investment industry. So if you are responsible for the hiring decisions at your firm, once again, you should be conducting a background check. Probably the easiest way to have an ethical workplace is what? Hire ethical people. So to wrap this up, once again, don't do anything that you would regret the next day or make your mom mad at you. Okay? That would cover misconduct. All right, let's look at our last standard in our discussion today, and that would be a new standard, standard 1A, the standard of competence. Members and candidates must act with and maintain the competence necessary to fulfill their professional responsibilities. So the standard requires you to act with and maintain appropriate knowledge, skills, and diligence when you carry out your professional responsibilities so that you provide a high standard of professional service for your clients and employers. So what's the recommended guidance here? Well, the idea is that you need to be competent, right? So we're going to look at the nature of abilities, skills, and knowledge depends on the member or candidate's specific responsibility. So you want to match your abilities to that responsibility. So, for example, you really don't know anything about estate planning, but you have a client asking you about estate planning. What should you do? Well, you should gain the knowledge of estate planning or bring in another special or another advisor to help you with that client. So you want to know your abilities and your limitations and how that relates to your responsibility. Now, obviously, this could vary from role to role. So in assuming a new role, it's up to you to develop the needed abilities, skills, and knowledge. I sort of alluded to that with that estate planning example. Now, over time, the professional responsibilities of members and candidates may change or expand. That might even be what's going on with you personally now, requiring new or different knowledge, skills, and abilities. So very important. I think they would give you some sort of test question there that would indicate that you're being asked about something you're not quite up to date on and what you need to do to become competent in that area. All right, so what are some of the recommended procedures? Well, obviously, you can participate in training, professional development, or continuing ed, going right back to my estate planning example. The second bullet point here, acquire professional designations. I think we all know about this one, right? CFA. You can attend seminars and conferences. That would be a good idea, like even webinars. That would be another good example. You can participate in professional organizations, say expert groups. And then also, lastly, you can engage in informal self-study. Now, I really like this last bullet point because I believe strongly in lifelong learning.
Hey guys, I think I'm done now. We have 8. I am done for the day. Done for the day. Done for the day.